Hello everybody. So today, this is the first presentation that I'm creating on a new approach to video game design. And this is called Moddable UI Design, a presentation in a new approach to community-oriented video game design and production. By Roger Merrifield. That's me. And I don't mind telling people that. I'd rather people actually cite my name for, my work. So, Part 1. Introduction to Moddable UI. What is Moddable UI, or user interface? So, let's go over just each slide and kind of go into the details of what I wrote up here. Moddable UI is a design language towards game development that allows for interchangeable interface components comparable to a client-server relationship. So let's explain this in other words for people who may not understand what I mean by that in less technical terms. So a client-server relationship is actually very similar to the kind of relationship that your computer has when communicating through a web browser. The browser is a client. A client takes the data that comes from the internet and it organizes it and presents it in a way to the user for them to understand. But it also allows them to, put in their own inputs, like, for example, interacting with a button or submitting a form or something like that. Now, in a website, these are usually maintained by something called web requests, right? These are usually REST or SOAP or whatever. There's a bunch of them. Usually you're going to encounter REST. So, for example, if you open the developer console in your browser with the F12 key, you can see all these different things. And if you switch to the network tab, usually, that's what it is in Firefox and forked projects off of Firefox, it says networks tab, right? And that will show you all of the different REST requests that are being made in order to, show a web page. And you can even see, what communications are going on. And this is, in fact, how you can detect what trackers are on a website, for example, right? Through just identifying their source and things like that. And then there's the other side of this relationship. That's the server. That's a computer many could be just in the other room, but usually it's many miles away that's being talked to over the internet. And it's very important that this server controls its inputs. You don't want to be able to ask it for literally anything over the internet. That's a huge security concern, and in fact, that is a large aspect of what computer-oriented kind of vulnerabilities are based around. There's a small aside, there are also social-oriented kind of password phishing kind of thing. But when we're talking about actually getting around vulnerabilities in a computer setting, that is what we're doing. We're making the server do things that it's trying to control to not do, right? And so because of that, the server has a lot of control over what it does. But the client could technically be anything, realistically. Private companies may try to control what your client looks like here and there through, various kind of heartbeat checks and stuff. But, in principle, the client could be changed to anything, right? That's what allows, for example, various plugins to act as dark mode or high contrast mode and things like that when, in the past, those things were not embedded in the browser and they still don't work properly. So, sometimes we still do need to use plugins for those things. So what makes this really interesting is that user interface is developed separately from the game's core logic processing cycle, which allows these components to be swapped out by modders, right? So the component that is basically assigned to the client side, right? And this will be more clear when I draw the basic architecture of how this kind of approach to game design works, right? Essentially, it means that all the parts that would be the client side on a website, right, are swappable, right? You could change it to be pretty much anything you wanted. You could have it be a command line interface. You could have it be like a different video game. And I think a really good example was there was a tweet a few days ago of a person showing a project that they worked on where it was basically like Twitter but as a card game. And this is the kind of thing that's possible with a moddable UI approach, right? So why don't we take that to video games, right? In fact, video games, many online video games already have a client-server relationship. It's just that the video game client itself is limited in how you're able to actually mod it. We want to make it so that the game itself can be modified in a similar way. It is also an attempt to establish a development ecosystem that encourages exchange of UI solutions, right? So when we have an open source community that promotes different kinds of design patterns within various game engines and, design territories and things like that, right? We can share our solutions to various problems, right? And this becomes very apparent in something like video game accessibility, which has been proven time and time again to be extremely difficult and expensive to attempt to generalize, and also comes with many complications, right? Which is very difficult when you're trying to take something as complicated and expansive as a video game, which can be almost anything, and trying to conform it to particular UI standards, right? Instead of having a completely closed off interface, instead these games have an open client, right, that can be modified, and this allows the community to develop solutions, and those solutions can also end up being used in other projects and eventually expanding and developing an ecosystem of UI solutions for issues such as accessibility. Why moddable UI? It allows for collaborative and community development towards improved user interface and quality of life features, especially as new models are explored. Think about how in the past, video games had major issues with their game design. And we will find in the next 10 years that even though we think that the current way that we design games right now is perfectly fine, there will be trends that date it, right? I think like one of the most notable trends actually in UI right now is that stupid Dark Souls interface that's god awful, that's everywhere. Fuck that. It's everywhere. Sorry for swearing, but that's how I roll, okay? Take it or leave it. But seriously, it looks like garbage, and that's everywhere. And you're gonna see that in 10 years. You're gonna be like, oh my god, Punished Felix was completely right. It's everywhere. It's awful. And this allows us to take games that may have been designed in that way and design them in a new way, right? And try different interfaces, and it allows them to have quality of life features that allows them to live longer and longer. Game preservation and the ability to, actually enjoy a game and own it for a long time is a very serious concern for both developers and, gamers. And this allows for a way for games to, effectively live for a very long time. As many people have pointed out, moddability is one of the best things that you can give your game to let it last forever, right? So why not give it a moddable UI that allows for quality of life improvements in the user interface and accessibility improvements to be much easier to implement? It also encourages an open source development strategy that allows for many participants. A major issue, for example, in accessibility game development is that while, disabled people may have access to consulting positions and may offer their support or ideas, they don't necessarily have development positions. They don't necessarily have positions of privileged access to things like the code and creative input. And open source development is a real boon for disabled people, because even within companies such as Freedom Scientific that hire a large number of disabled people, it's still an exclusive club that most disabled people do not have access to. But open source development actually opens the doors for disabled developers all across the world. who may be interested in moddable UI. Now, I understand that moddable UI is not for everyone. I think like there's going to be a lot of people who are going to feel that moddable UI is opposed to the kind of control that they want to maintain over their user interface. However, I think that moddable UI is really appealing to the following demographics. I forgot to also add that open source advocates is a good one, but yeah, just throw that on the bottom. But indie game developers, right? And it's good for indie game developers because they have access to a whole library produced by an open source community of different UI solutions that they can just kind of like take a template of and slightly adjust for their particular game and, easily have, various UI solutions. One of the biggest challenges for many game developers is getting to the point where they can develop like the part of the game they want to build, right? Like some of us, like me, I like to build all those parts myself, but a lot of people don't, right? And they don't necessarily want to use like, a closed asset that, they have to pay money for and is difficult to have, community support for. Indie game development would really benefit from having an open source, modular, repository like this. Disabled users. I will go into this in more detail, but the primary motivation for designing moddable UI is to try to give an alternative to closed models, closed model approaches in accessibility in the professional gaming accessibility industry, right? These closed models, for example, integrating accessibility features integrated into closed source, game engines, and within the level of game engines and privatized operating systems and things like that. This closed model has a lot of complications, especially for end users and the freedom of choice for users and developers alike. So trying to address these concerns is really, really, a major motivation for trying to kind of develop an open source community model for UI development. And an emphasis on accessibility is really the key here, because the idea is that, if an interface does have an accessibility gap, it can be integrated with a mod, relatively reasonably easily to address that accessibility lapse, and also have that documentation available for later. That is really important. It is really important that other people can read and evaluate and think about the same questions and logic that led to the answer that was provided for a particular solution. Other users that would really benefit from this kind of approach to game design are users who like freedom in UI customization. I'm sure that many people are noticing how limited we are in being able to express our ability to customize user interfaces, and it's fucking annoying, right? A lot of people would appreciate having more customizability in their user interfaces by being able to, just build their own. Finally, avant-garde and experimental game designers would love to experiment with the possibilities of having modular interfaces. I mean, I know what kind of books you guys read. You'd love this. All right? I'm telling you. All 5 of you. Anyways, moddable UI as a quality of life feature. Moddable UI allows end users to define how they want UI to be interacted with, right? And this is, again, really important. Like I pointed out, UI comes and goes. These trends are designed to, function within a particular time and place, right? Allowing for modular UI allows for an expansive, exploration of different ways of designing possible UI features and quality of life features that are introduced over time, we should have it so that we can press A, right, or something like that. I think whenever I think of quality of life features, I think of Pokemon Red and Blue. I think everybody forgets that Pokemon Red and Blue and Pokemon Gold and Silver introduced the second Gold and Silver games, they introduced a ton of minor UI improvements that make the game so much easier to navigate and doesn't feel like a brick when you're trying to get through the menus. It really makes a difference, right? Especially, and it also can really benefit, developers that are just less experienced, who, want to be able to make a game, but maybe don't have the experience to really make a UI that is as good as they could potentially make it. So anyways, as gaming expectations evolve, it allows for the modding community to develop new inputs and outputs even long after a developer has abandoned the project. Project abandonment is a major issue for game preservation and the continuation of game communities. When a project is abandoned, it can often lead to serious problems with porting and things like that. Part of the reason why Doom, for example, still maintains cultural relevance is even though the code is still technically licensed, it's open source and allows for the replication of its engine in so many different ways. Like there are still modern Doom game engines that are still running today, and people still play Doom, and it has modern features thanks to the fact that the code is open, right? But a lot of developers may not want to release their code to be open source, and that's completely understandable, right? Especially when you're trying to release a game on a commercial scale as an indie game developer who's very vulnerable to, lost sales and things like that, right? So having a modular UI allows for that kind of quality of life without having to need to release that source code if the developer doesn't want to. And having the important parts moddable and modular. As long as the interface provided by the developer is sufficient, the modding community can make improvements to the user interface design. So basically, if the surface that the developer defines for this interface is sufficient and well described, mod developers can do all sorts of shit with it. Moddable UI as Moddable UI as an accessibility development model. One point of interest is accessibility design. Closed and non-moddable development models do not allow for most disabled people to contribute directly to their accessibility easily, are vulnerable to aging, and restrict consumer choice. So, for example, let's think of Apple. Right? Now, Apple is notorious within the accessibility professionals industry for having a very well integrated accessibility model that really pays attention to the general design of apps and communicates them clearly to end users. And this is good, except for the fact that this is also unfortunately leveraged as a point of competition. Now, I understand that some naive people may believe, especially people who are not disabled, may believe that it's actually okay for Apple to do this because, Apple deserved it because they invested all their money into R&D or whatever. But this is horseshit, right? What actually ends up happening is that disabled end users lose their freedom of choice because Apple decided to make it closed source. See, if Apple really gave a flying fuck about disabled users and wasn't just exploiting them for, gaining at one point over 80% of the market cap of disabled users, which is kind of fucking insane for mobile market, right? The reason why they did that was so that they could secure part of the market share, right? And they had the resources to be able to outcompete, less invested models, right? And what ended up happening is that end users ended up using Apple most of the time just because it was more usable. Now imagine for a second that you are a blind, advocate for privacy, and you don't really want to use fucking Apple because Apple is a closed ecosystem that has full control over your goddamn data. But now you have to make the choice between using a phone that actually makes sense to use or a phone that sucks to use but is not Apple, right? I'm certain that there are many, many people who are blind or visually impaired who do not want to use Apple but feel that they have to because of this closed source development. This kind of approach to accessibility development is intended to undo those kinds of effects. Quite frankly, we should be punishing companies who are exploiting these kinds of niche markets to try to gain, some kind of small advantage. This is unfair to disabled users and is exploitative of their niche needs, right? Now, even in companies that have primarily disabled people contributing and being, part of their workforce, such as in the case of Freedom Scientific, the owners of the screen reader JAWS, right? It still is limiting what a disabled person, an everyday disabled person, is able to contribute towards, any sort of given accessibility implementation in regards to JAWS, right? You have to get hired at Freedom Scientific first. Then you have to get hired in a position that is specifically, oriented towards, the design of the screen reader and the way that it does things. And then you just have to hope that your management allows the changes to even, go through. Now, NVDA, you're still going to have people who are going to be evaluating your, pull requests and all that crap. But here's the thing, right? NVDA, anybody can potentially contribute. So I could contribute, some random blind person halfway across the world can contribute, and as a result, it is much more able for disabled people that these solutions are supposed to help to be able to have access to and, create something that collectively that actually works for everybody, right? And that's part of the reason why NVDA became so popular. It's modular, and it's modular in the sense that it has a ton of plugin support, right? Okay. Moddable UI as accessibility development model continued. Moddable UI allows for mods to be developed after release to improve accessibility models, improve quality of life features, and update the game towards modernized standards. Now, the other two I've gone over in plenty, but with accessibility models, right, they're always developing, right? One of the big problems within the professional gaming industry is that it is notorious for neglecting the needs of people with migraines, right? Which I am somebody with migraines. I can tell you all about that. It fucking sucks, right? And a big problem with this is that, I don't think these people who are, advocating for accessibility in this industry understand that while it sucks that if you're blind you can't play a game, or if you're colorblind it disrupts your gameplay experience or may even make a game unplayable, but when I play a game that triggers my migraines, I am disabled for up to 12 to 36 hours. I have to lay down and try to not vomit everywhere half the time when this shit happens. And I have many experiences that make me very upset about this, right? But wouldn't it just be nice if we could just easily mod those problems out of the way and just be like, oh, you want to have a game that triggers my migraines? Well, let me just take the API that you have for your game and just design a UI that doesn't trigger my fucking migraines. I know some people will still want to make games that trigger migraines, but this actually at least allows people who make minor mistakes like that to not necessarily be beaten over the head by it, but to have an actual solution. And plus, they can even take that solution and integrate it into their main game, just like an open source project taking in some kind of taking a upstream from a fork. It's not that crazy, right? It's been done for 30 years now. Now, the biggest barrier to making old games accessible is the lack of clear interface to access critical data presented by the UI, requiring technical memory research. Now, let me show you how old games are generally made more accessible, right? This is the challenge of making old games accessible. Now look at on the right. That is some code that is used to determine in Pokemon Crystal a special script that allows you to connect to a screen reader and read certain things off the screen, right? This is part of that script that allows that to happen. Can you tell anything about what's going on here? No. You have no idea what the hell any of this is, right? And this is important because in order to build something like this, it requires a crap ton of research and reverse engineering skills. This requires intricate knowledge of games and software emulation and where things are stored in memory, and usually involves injection of a routine when certain conditions are met. So basically there's a constant monitoring of what's going on in the game state being represented through analyzing memory addresses, and when something is triggered, it will trigger a TTS script, and it will read from a memory buffer to tell what text to read. It's very challenging. Most people who are professionally employed in video games industry are not up to the task, and I am willing to bet that nobody who sees this, who is professionally employed in the video game industry, who's making games in Unity or Unreal or anything like that, can do anything like this. They probably don't even know how memory is managed in their own game engine unless they're actually working on it. Modular games make this much easier. See, on the right, this is a representation of the REST API that I was talking about earlier, the client-server relationship that was described in, the browser that I was talking about earlier. Look how much easier it is to understand what is being received. Imagine if for a second, when I asked Pokemon Crystal version, I was able to get a little bit of information like we see on the right, where it contains variables and data. That would be a lot easier to work with, wouldn't it? This splitting the UI into a modular environment allows us to replicate these server-client structures. The isolation of components also improves code reliability because, well, now you're not having this spaghetti shit everywhere, but you're actually separating these functions from each other. Instead of requiring reverse engineering, the interface can be made public through documentation. And that documentation can also be automated if you know how to do your docs. Now, this is important. Moddable UI as accessibility is not an accessibility model or standardization. It is an approach to designing video games that allows for UI to be modified in the future by end users, as well as a means to encourage an alternative to closed source development ecosystems for accessibility. It is advised to reference web accessibility guidelines and work with disabled consultants, especially sensory and motor impaired users. Benefit to Moddable UI design. It's a clear separation of input, output, and logic layers of a game. That's going to really reduce your spaghetti code, guys. Seriously, I see what kind of code these people put in their tutorials, and I'm just going to tell you guys, video game developers, you guys are kind of seen as the worst developers in tech, and there's a reason for that. You're kind of on the level of script kiddies. This is something that will discipline you to make you a better developer. Noticeable reduction of redundant or poorly organized code. Having your inputs in one place being pulled every single cycle that is processed means that you only have one place where that's all being managed. You don't have to go and search for it all the damn time. Alright? Encourages a clear, concise approach and good development practices for long-term projects. It keeps you organized. It keeps you thinking, okay, where do I put the output? Where do I put the input? And the thing is that as I started developing using this particular approach, even though in Godot it's kind of difficult and heavy, we are going to be trying to develop our own game engine to make a game engine that works around this, but Godot is more used because of its output and it's like, it's like 3D rendering and stuff. I don't want to have to build that from scratch, right? But it does allow me to offer like a basic prototype to show these things. But because I have to think consciously about how I'm designing everything, because I have to build around these limitations, it means that I'm also thinking very consciously about organizing my code and keeping things consistent. End users also have significant control over their user experience. I mean, you could literally, I am not done writing the documentation for this yet, and it will be a process that will probably take a few weeks because it's going to be on and off for me. I have other projects. But the thing is that you can reference the documentation. I'm going to have the surfaces of these APIs visible, at least within a few days, and you can just, use that to design your own, right? And you can experiment with it yourself. And as I build more documentation, that will be easier to do. Okay. Negatives of Moddable UI design. It requires more technical skill to organize projects. This is not something that you can just jump into right now. Like I said, we do want to develop a game engine to make it easier, but right now you do have to put in a lot of conscious effort to design games in this way in most game engines. It requires input validation to prevent cheating. This is an extra step that, you might forget about or not think about consciously. You have to think about input validation. But you should be doing that anyway, because that's actually one of the most common vulnerabilities in video games. So yeah, you should be doing that anyway. Requires careful resource management design or may lead to performance issues due to creating resources dynamically. We are loading mods after all, so we need to think consciously about what we're doing when we're loading mods. In languages that do not support structs, such as Godot, there may be performance issues in more abstract data structures. In Godot, since I'm using base Godot, I'm not using C# Godot, there is no struct available. You only have dictionaries, and dictionaries are abstract in Godot, so they do have some performance limitations. Modern game engines encourage a non-separated design and make management of design difficult. This means that if I wanted to make a game in this particular way in a modern game engine like Unity or Godot, it's really annoying because of a bunch of structural crap that gets in the way. We really need our own game engine for this eventually, but for now, it's fine to explore what is possible through Godot. Part 2. Moddable UI design. Definitions. Mod layer. The space that can be freely modified by the end users through mods. Developer layer. The space considered immutable to end users. So basically, the mod layer is the layer that end users can change and customize through their own programs, while the developer layer is the layer that is distributed by the developer and is essentially a closed black box with a surface for API. So here is a general diagram, and it's split into 3 parts. We have the input mod user layer on the left. And on the right, we have the output mod user layer, which is just one component. It's just the output. And in the middle, we have the game developer layer, right? So let's go through each component as it would be cycled at the beginning of a step all the way to the end of a step, right? So we have the input, right? This gathers inputs, right? So like, it could be your keyboard, controller, mouse, even text that may be received from an output. This is processed into an abstract object that represents the values of the input, right? This is not necessarily, what the state of the input is. Like, it's not whether a button is being pressed. It's rather a representation of what those inputs mean. So, for example, if I was moving with the axis on my controller, it means that I would be interpreting that as movement, and I would be recording that as movement in the input. Right? And it's important to design it this way because it allows for many different kinds of inputs to be processed. You're passing the vector of what direction you're going in. You're not passing what inputs you actually put in, if that makes sense, right? Now, the next step, which is inside of the game developer layer, and this is very important, is the input validation. It is very important that input validation is within the game developer layer, because think about it. You don't want cheaters to have access to input validation. You want to have it act as like a cop. You want to be like, okay, is this allowed? Nope. Okay, we're going to truncate that. We're going to kick you out of the server for that, or whatever. Input validation is a step that basically validates what is coming in every step, and it is mandatory, or else you're gonna get stuff like Epona in the Wii on Twilight Princess, where you get the huge name that allows you to run arbitrary code and install boot me. You don't want that. Be smart. Process timing step. Now this is back into the mod layer. Now the process timing step is kind of like a traffic cop. It's basically determining when the input frame is allowed to progress to a video game processing unit frame, right? So basically, and this is really important for user interfaces like text boxes or command line interfaces or text-based interfaces, where it is waiting for the user to provide a text input before anything is even processed, right? You don't want to have that processing every frame, right? You want to be able to control the timing for that. So that's what that is all about. Now we're back into the game developer layer. This is the video game processing unit. This is the part of the game that actually does the logic of the game. This has the abstract representations. This has all that crap, right? That is being worked on. This, again, is a part of the game that we do not want mods to really have access to, right? So we treat this separately, like its own little server, right? Now, finally, this will output a value, or, well, rather, a dictionary or struct of values, and this will be used to display the output, which again is back into the mod user layer and allows the mod to modify it to whatever the developer wants it to be, right? You're just taking a bunch of variables, just like a website takes a bunch of variables to render the web page on the client, right? You're doing the same thing, but it's in a video game. Isn't that fun? Yeah, and then the output finally returns some final values back to the input, and that's really important for user interfaces like text-based interfaces where you're going to have an input, because how else is the input going to know what the text says? It only exists in the output space. You have to communicate it to the output. So this creates this looping cycle that allows for the transmission of this information in a controlled way that allows for the input processing and the input processing timing and output layers to be completely interchanged with something else. Input step. This exists in the mod layer. This captures input state and transforms it into an abstraction that matches the vGPU's surface API functions. The input validation step. This exists in the developer layer. It transforms output from the input step into valid game restraints. It prevents out of bounds, unintentional, or cheating behaviors as defined by the developer. Process timing layer. It exists in the mod layer. It interprets the result of the input validation layer, and it determines if a process frame should be run on this frame. Acts like the vGPU's traffic controller. It's useful for interfaces such as text-based interfaces that will not need to process every frame. vGPU step exists in the developer layer. Consists of the primary game logic. Transforms the modified input state into an updated game state. Output layer exists in the mod layer. Transforms the output state produced by the vGPU and produces output for the player. It produces a final output state usable for the next input state, useful for reading and passing text on the input on the UI. And it should be isolated on its own thread or only called once per frame. That's really important, guys. The output should only be processed once. Think of it like how on retro gaming consoles you have the v-blank state, right? That's the time you get to write everything to the screen. That's the way you should look at output. One other thing, you can stack components in this design, right? So let's say you like the UI, but you just want to add maybe a few things to make it easier for you to work with, right? You can actually do that really easily because it can run multiple UIs at the same time, right? You got to still test it to make sure it's not conflicting and doing silly stuff, but basically you can add another thing onto the output or another input device or anything like that. You don't have to replace it all, right? So, all right, are you ready to see a demo and go over its structure? All right, give me 1 second. I gotta open the... All right, so let's open the game. So this is an export of the game that I created, right? And I am going to just navigate and real quick and show you kind of like the primary user interface that was created. It's basically a walking simulator, right? I can walk around, little footsteps, so cute. Look at them go. And there's a couple other features. I can like look at something far away. I can look at the ground. I can talk to things. There's also a proximity audio detector. That's what that buzzing noise is you might be hearing. Okay. So now you can see that I can move around, right? Now here's where things get kind of cool. Now we can go into... actually, I don't want to show that because I don't want to... But I'll just cut that out. Now we can switch user interfaces. The way that this is designed in this particular model is to press F2 and it will swap user interfaces. Now check this out. Yeah, that's a command line. So we can type in text and we can ask to do things, right? So let's just do a demonstration to show that it is actually interacting with the same interacting with the same basic internal world, basically. So let's say rotate left, I don't know, 90 degrees, right? Now if we switch, he turns. We do it again. And he does it again. See? We can move as well. So he moved. He moved again. And as you can see, it's interacting with the same world. It's just changing the user interface. And the thing is that I will go over the code to demonstrate that it is not actually part of the game. It is actually being loaded from a mod. So first, I'm going to show the export models that we used for this, right? So there are two exports. So usually when you export a game in Godot, you're going to export in one unless you're exporting mod packs, right? So this is the main thread, right? And we can see that it contains all of the resources except from the mod directory, right? But if we look at this, the demonstration, or the mod demonstration, it does have the mod stuff. And basically how this works is that this exports the actual full thing, and this exports the pack file, right? And a pack file is just a mod file in Godot, right? Okay, so let's just go over the file structure real quick. I don't know how visible this is. Hopefully you can read it. Maybe I can just make this bigger. Yeah. Okay, here you go. So we have asset. This is just common assets. Like, I like to put it in an asset directory and declare it so that mod users can use the same assets, right? Core is just the core game engine components, right? Access reader, this is just a function that allows me to use access kit to call strings directly. This is why I don't like it when web developers design game accessibility, because there are actually use cases where you do just want to read text, right? And this is kind of difficult when you focus on a DOM-oriented design. You basically have to create an object with a bunch of custom handling that manages it. And the reason why you want to do it this way is because there's not sufficient testing to demonstrate that the TTS functions of Godot are actually sufficient to be connected to a screen reader and detect screen readers, right? It's just not clear in the documentation if that is true. So in order to ensure that it is connecting to a screen reader when possible, I instead use access kit. And unfortunately, you are forced to use a DOM-oriented design. And I have many things to say about web developers who think that they can put DOM-oriented designs on everything, but maybe one day this will be able to change the world. I don't know. I kind of hope. It's a little bit of a grandiose statement to say, but I mean, you gotta believe in something. So, you know, this is separated into a couple components. We have the debugger stuff here. That's not really used for anything super crazy. These are core classes for my user interface. So, like, UI canvas is basically like the core UI element, right? And the idea is that you can switch between UI canvases if you want. And UI base is a core UI like object that is used in. They can either be used together in a single canvas, operating and interacting with each other, or they could be stacked like a modal interface. So, like when a text box, or not a text box, a pop-up box appears and says, do you want to close the game? Right? That is done by pushing a new UI that is inherited from UI base onto the UI stack, right? And you can look at all this code. It's on the repository in the description if you actually want to take a look at it. I'm still cleaning up a lot of things. There's not a lot of documentation yet, but I will be cleaning up things in the next few days. And generic, these are basically generic structures for each UI component. So something that is important about Godot is that Godot has two processing threads. This is really important, right? Because the thing is that the idle thread operates at a different pace than the physics thread. The physics thread always runs at the game's frames per second, right? While the idle thread has variable processing times. And this is really important because this means that if you are using your inputs, right, the inputs can be overwritten and can interfere with each other if you do not properly isolate the threads. This is really important. This was something that I discovered because I made a mistake in my initial analysis, and it was really annoying to have to be able to fix. But I'm really glad that I did this prototype to realize how core and critical that really is. Thread management is always really important, right? And I guess I just wasn't paying attention, because I mean, if you read like the actual documentation on how to write smash the creeps or squash the creeps or whatever it's called, they literally like mix up shit. It's very like, they do not write the code in a way that actually consciously makes you think of the threading, right? So it just was a mistake. So, but it's something that I learned through doing this, and that's why you do it. So ext, what is this? I actually don't know what this is. Oh, I think this was the original, mod folder, but I just never used it. I'm pretty sure I can delete that, but I'll have to check later. So here is the core game stuff, right? Now, in this, right, we actually have we do not define the base UI as a mod, right? It's actually part of the game, right? So that 3D thing, right? If you take out the mod file, you can experiment with this yourself, right? Because when you actually compile the game the first time, right, the mod file is not placed in the proper location to be able to actually execute the mod, right? So if you try pressing the F2 button, it's just going to reset the 3D model, or the 3D user interfaces, and it's just going to like basically refresh them, right? Because it's just trying to reload the same one because it doesn't have access to that mod file, right? So there is a base UI that is programmed in here, and each UI is kind of separated into different parts. So we have 3 user interfaces. We have that intro box, right, which is just something I threw together really quick to explain what it does. We have the main sequence, that's the walking, that's the movement. And we have the text box. That's when the text box is displayed to read something on the screen, right? And essentially how this works is that main is the base UI that's running pretty much on the bottom of the stack, and the intro and the text boxes are pushed onto the top of the stack, or so that processing always occurs on the top of the stack, so that way there's no inputs, screwing around with this main thing right here, right? Using a processing stack is a very good way to use a structure to be able to control what is receiving inputs at a given time. I would highly recommend that structure in any game, right? Now, mod is just the mod folder, right? Now, when we look at one of these user interfaces, the core user interface is something that inherits this UI, inherits UI base. Right, UI base has all the code that manages all of the UI module swapping stuff, right? And we can see these definitions here on the right, right? We have the mod location, we have the pack location, we have the inputs array, because we can have multiple inputs running at once. We can have multiple outputs running at once, but we can only have one idle and one physics running at once. And if there's one not defined, it's just ignored, right? I mean, a lot of, like, for example, a text box is not, you're not really paying attention to the physics frame, right? You don't really care what the physics is doing because it's a text box, right? It's not like a character moving around and hitting collisions, right? So you can just ignore that. It's kind of funny because I don't actually define the physics thing here for default, because it's running every frame. I don't need to define a custom physics frame. Let's see. Does this one actually have a custom one? Does idle have custom? Oh, no. Idle is just... I thought I might have it custom, but I ended up not using it that way. But, yeah, so that's just kind of an overview of the work that I've done. You can take a look at the code in the description, and I also have some documents that I've written about, my motivations for this and the direction I want to take it. And this is not something that I am just working on my own. I have multiple friends that are helping contribute, and we are hoping to develop a game engine within a few years as we start to crystallize and formalize our theory a bit more. So, yeah, I really appreciate people having having patience for me putting this presentation together. I know that it was kind of a wait. I kind of got, my own health issues kind of interfered with my ability to, concentrate. I know some people probably thought that me telegraphing to a certain someone that I was going to troll him for a few days was me going crazy. That was actually the least crazy thing. When I go crazy, I just kind of like stand around and listen to music and twirl in circles for like 80% of my day. That's really where my time is going. I mean, I wish people knew what it was really like behind the computer, but that's not a huge deal. But yeah, so now you guys know what direction that this is going in, and the next step is we are going to make another prototype. This prototype is actually going to be a functional game and may actually even be on the Steam store, and it is intended to be a sort of jumping project between the big project that I'm working on, the game that I announced about Félix-Deux, and kind of like a way to kind of like get parts of that game engine working and functional, but with a smaller project that I can kind of use to like bring attention to my work, and also, bring in a little revenue, maybe even, I'm thinking about selling this little title for like $5. It's just something I'm going to throw together in like a month or two. But yeah, it's going to just be something so that I can get the movement engine working, right? And because the engine is modular and has a modular UI, I can just have the engine working for this game and then transfer it to the next one and just have to build a new output for it. So, everything kind of will, this is another advantage to modular design. You can build more factories with it. You can build more machines. Okay, anyways, that's enough for me for now. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this presentation, and I hope that it helps you think maybe a little bit more about your UI design, maybe, or even participate in the project. Share with your friends and, provide feedback, whatever. Take it easy.